evening, everyone. We did a talk earlier today, and I noticed that Dayna liked to walk around, so she's somehow we're constraining her. Her energy has to stay in exactly this place tonight. So I hope we'll see how it goes. She might grab the mic and just have to do something crazy. Anyway, I'd like to thank the Coast Salish nations of this region for welcoming us, and particularly the University of Victoria, to their territory. And welcome to the City Talks. This is the fifth year that we have held the City Talks. They are put on by the Committee for Urban Studies, which is a group of scholars from the University of Victoria from a variety of faculties and departments across campus. And we are supported and continue to be supported by a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, as well as widely supported by several faculties and departments on campus. So we truly are an interdisciplinary effort. Along with the Faculty of Law, where I hail from, my name is Deborah Curran, and I have taken on organizing the tasks for the talks for this fall. The topic is broadly environmental justice. So environmental justice referring to and the recognition in law that the negative impacts, particularly health impacts, felt by the human population of environmental harm is disproportionately experienced by marginalized and racialized communities across the world, but it has gained particular attention in the United States over the past 40 years or so. It is a phenomenon that's well recognized in law and other disciplines. However, we don't talk about it all that openly in Canada in a very robust way, particularly in terms of law reform in our country. So that is why, hence the need for these talks and the interest in having these talks. We have Dayna Scott is kicking off the series this fall, and I'll introduce her shortly. But just to let you know, we also have Jeff Masuda, who is recently of Queen's University, who will be joining us on October 16th. And he's really posing some questions about whether we have environmental injustice in Canada, and he's using examples from his research that he's done in Winnipeg and most recently in Vancouver. And then we have Julie C., who hails from the University of California at Davis, and she is coming on November 20th, and she's done extensive work on environmental justice in the United States, and most recently in China. So she brings a more international perspective to our talks for the fall, but I explicitly wanted to start off with the Canadian perspective such that it is. Just to let you know, the theme for the spring term of City Talks, which are the third Thursday of every month, January, February, March, or at least we try and hold to that schedule, will be racism and xenophobia in European Union cities. All right, without further ado, I would like to introduce Dayna, who is an associate professor at the Osgoode Hall Law School, and she is also jointly appointed to the Masters in Environmental Studies program at York University. She's also the director of the National Network on Environments and Women's Health. She holds her graduate degrees from York and Osgoode, and her work broadly focuses on environmental justice, gender and environmental health, feminist theory of the body, critical sociology of risk, and trends in regulation and government. She's really interested in critical investigation of the potential of law to protect the environment and to secure equal access to environmental health and contribute to social justice. Her research and teaching are thus preoccupied with how and how effectively communities and their advocates can employ law in their struggles against environmental injustice. Her dissertation, for example, judged the transformative potential of international law's precautionary principle, which is well understood and stated at a level of principle, but not applied very well on the ground from an enforcement perspective. Right now, she is a co-investigator on a project that's looking at, it's called Regulatory Chill, and it's looking at contemporary constraints to decision-making to protect the environment, specifically focusing on international trade agreements. And she is about to have a book come out, is that right? An edited collection with UBC Press, and it's called Consuming Chemicals, Law, Science, and Policy for Women's Health from UBC Press. You might have read her, in fact, in the past without knowing it. She wrote a great op-ed this summer in the Globe and Mail about the Northern Gateway Pipeline, arguing against the Northern Gateway Pipeline or its building in British Columbia. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dayna.
Thank you. So thanks to Deb Kern for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you tonight, and also to the Committee on Urban Studies for setting up a series to talk about environmental justice in Canada, because I think that's great, and I wish I could be here for the rest of the talks. It's nice for me to have the opportunity tonight to talk about some work that I've been mulling over for quite a while. So it's the synthesis of several sort of disparate strands of research that I've been pursuing in the area of environmental justice, and what I'm going to try to do tonight is bring some of those together to give us a bigger picture of what I think is going on, specifically with relation to toxics regulations in Canada. And so what I'm hoping to do is combine insights from the ecological citizenship literature with some stuff that's coming out of critical geography, to explore and propose new models of ecological citizenship that can guide us in our aspirations to live a good green life in the city. And so at the same time, I'm going to try and bring forward some observations on recent trends in law and regulation with respect to the environment that can help us to understand the implications of a shift towards what we call precautionary consumption as a central practice in contemporary notions of ecological citizenship. So this central task tonight is to understand the relationship between practices of ecological citizenship and the dynamics through which cities project their effects, according to Saskia Sassen, onto a broader set of domains and terrains. So I'm going to start with a bit of where I come from. And you can see that the edited collection has changed its name since I haven't updated my website about that, I guess. But basically, this is coming out of work I've been doing for about 6 years as the director of the National Network on Environments and Women's Health. And many of us that have been researching inside the network have contributed to this forthcoming volume. And basically, we've been struggling with how to deal with the routine, chronic exposures to chemicals that now characterizes existence in the modern world. So we're trying to tease apart the effects of these exposures on the body, on society, on gender and class relations. And we've approached the problem both from a production and a consumption angle. So what I mean by that is that we consider the consumption of chemicals by consumers to be inseparable from the production of chemicals, and therefore the production of pollution that's involved in that process. So this could include air pollution, water pollution, soil contamination, etc. A few years ago, I began trying to reconcile these insights about the regulation of toxics with work I had been undertaking in collaboration with activists from the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, which is near Sarnia, Ontario. Aamjiwnaang is downstream and downwind of Canada's Chemical Valley, a cluster of petroleum refineries, utilities, and chemical manufacturing plants. Here, residents suffer environmental health effects related to these chronic pollution exposures, which include high rates of cancer and respiratory ailments, miscarriage and reproductive difficulties, asthma and developmental disorders, in addition to the most notorious, the skewed sex ratio. 2 residents of Aamjiwnaang First Nation are currently embroiled in constitutional litigation to test the theory that these everyday exposures to pollution is a violation of the Canadian Constitution, the Canadian Charter on Rights and Freedoms. And it's essentially a test of whether or not we have the benefit in Canada of the right to a healthy environment. So we've spent a great deal of time in Aamjiwnaang trying to work to understand the intricacies of the regulatory regime and how it might be transformed to be able to encapsulate cumulative impacts. The idea that they're experiencing multiple impacts from a number of different industrial sources that are clustered together. And in doing so, we've been trying to figure out the ways in which we can ameliorate the effects of pollution on people's everyday lives. And so what I want to do today is try and zoom out from Aamjiwnaang and draw connections between the ways we're living in the city, primarily the practices of precautionary consumption, and what's going on in places like Aamjiwnaang that are on the peripheries. And from this, I attempt to draw lessons for the construction of new models of ecological citizenship. Okay, so in Aamjiwnaang, the real issue is chronic state-sanctioned low-dose exposures to pollution that's emitted according to valid permits. So we ask the question of how our regulatory regimes fail to prevent these exposures. What kind of measures now do we turn to when we say we're getting tough on toxics, as our current government has? Now what I'm going to try to demonstrate today is the kinds of measures we turn to now are largely information-based. They require mostly simply monitoring and information disclosure. So we reach for tools like the mandatory labeling of carcinogens in personal care products or cosmetics, mandatory disclosure of the use of flame retardants or phthalates, for example. Things like cosmetic hot lists, pollutant release inventories. We do this based on what we call the citizen's right to know. And we're reaching for these kinds of tools because we think they're going to be able to enable us to protect ourselves where the state is unwilling or unable to do so. So we're engaging in practices that sociologist Nora McKendrick calls precautionary consumption. We're making everyday consumption choices to avoid certain toxic substances in consumer goods based on a belief that the regulators are failing to protect us, or that they're not applying precaution in fulfillment of their own duties, such as for the risk assessment of toxics at the federal level, or for the setting of threshold limits for air pollution at the provincial level, for example. So I'm going to argue today is that precautionary consumption as a strategy has several drawbacks. First, it has a gender problem. It's undeniably women's work. Second, it just might be futile. It might not actually be effective at reducing the toxic body burdens of those who are pouring their time, energy, and money into it. And third, and this is most critical, I think, there's a distinct possibility that it actually exacerbates inequalities in the distribution of environmental harms. That ethical, responsible, precautionary consumers in the city are actually projecting pollution and ill health onto those who are living on the peripheries, those downstream of the industrial complexes and the extractive sites that fuel our good green life. This is both in a spatial sense, i.e. those literally living downwind, but it's also true for those living downstream in a social and economic sense, including right here in the city. So in the end, I will argue what we need are less impoverished notions of what ecological citizenship entails. Okay. So I'm going to start by outlining the trends in law and regulation that lead me to say that the types of reforms we now expect to see are largely based on information disclosure. So we can think about, for example, the way that the federal and the Alberta government routinely reply to pressures about the environmental effects associated with production in the tar sands. As you know, they do so by repeatedly announcing new plans for better monitoring and disclosure of data. In other words, we're no closer to mitigating the devastation of land, water, and air, but we're presumably supposed to feel better or feel relieved that we have an increased understanding of just how bad the situation is. We can think also about the recent controversy over the federal government's refusal to add the chemicals used in fracking to the list of pollutants under the National Pollutant Release Inventory, the NPRI. So this is a federal database that's established by law requiring large emitters of certain substances to report annually on the volumes of their emissions and to make that information publicly available on the web. The logic behind this type of a scheme is that once managers are forced to turn their minds to the emissions and face the public scrutiny related to them, they will naturally work to find ways to reduce those emissions. So, the demand that fracking fluids be added to this list is a demand for information about the emissions of those fluids. Perhaps that's with the aim that the disclosure of the information is a tool in the broader fight against fracking, that it will be important for convincing residents to actively oppose the practice. In that sense, that the shroud of secrecy that the industry has had the benefit of operating under does need to be lifted in order for us to mount an active resistance. And in that sense, you could think of this kind of strategy as being understandable and commendable. But the formal policy rationale behind the legislated disclosure schemes, that the task of reporting will incentivize the industry to self-regulate, is not supported by the evidence from years of experience with the NPRI. Instead, the disclosures tend largely to fly under the radar, and in most cases the emissions are not decreasing at all, although they sometimes change form. So they can be converted from emissions to air into emissions to water, or sometimes they get turned into sludge and hauled away. So at any rate, what I'm trying to argue is that in these times of smart regulation, the best our governments can muster is a weak commitment incorporating voluntary measures intended apparently to incentivize industry to move in the direction that we desire. This analysis is complicated by the fact that these initiatives are often demanded and celebrated from the grassroots. So they're framed in the language of a citizen's right to know. To take another example, think about Toronto's Environmental Reporting and Disclosure Bylaw, which came into effect in 2010. This is a program aimed at small and medium-sized businesses throughout the city that emit toxic substances, and it's geared towards empowering residents to act in their own neighborhoods to put the pressure on those businesses to come clean. It was largely influenced by an inspired campaign by the advocacy group Toronto Environmental Alliance, called Secrecy is Toxic, which is here, in which Torontonians were invited to contribute to a wiki map, which revealed polluting activities throughout the city. What these kinds of reforms have in common is that they demand a lot from non-state actors, mostly individual citizens, and not much from state actors. Perhaps not surprisingly, the trend towards these kinds of reforms has now penetrated the campaigns of advocacy groups. So now, it's not that these are the best kinds of measures we can expect our governments to come up with, it's that these are the kinds of reforms that NGOs themselves are asking for. And this is true from organizations seeking to protect Canadians from toxics, such as Environmental Defence, to those seeking to implement breast cancer prevention, such as Breast Cancer Action Montreal, and many other organizations whose work I respect deeply. All have promoted labeling campaigns in recent years based on the idea of a citizen's right to know. Some of these groups have gone so far as to issue pamphlets or wallet cards with long lists of chemicals to avoid while shopping. And I picture myself, when I think about these campaigns, standing there in the pharmacy aisle. One child is dangling from the cart, another one is taking everything off all the shelves, and I'm apparently standing calmly, staring at the product label, checklist in hand, trying to figure out which shampoo is not going to cause hormone disruption in my growing children's bodies. And this is what makes me conflicted about these campaigns. We all want to see carcinogens and endocrine disruptors taken out of consumer products. We want to see flame retardants and phthalates taken out of furniture and electronics. But the focus on information, I think, is misguided. So instead of demanding a regulatory approach in which toxics are eliminated from the shelves based on the risk of harm, these calls simply accept that responsibility can instead be placed on the consumer to make choices based on her individual risk preferences. So the labeling of toxic and potentially toxic chemicals might be a feasible avenue for some in terms of reducing exposure, and Nora McKendrick has demonstrated this well. But again, I think it has serious limitations. Okay. So precautionary consumption has emerged as an identity-defining practice for many urbanites. It consists mainly of green or alternative shopping techniques undertaken by consumers who are trying to compensate for the fact that in their view the regulatory system is broken. Environmental campaigns that fuel this practice are feeding a voracious appetite. Amongst the women that Nora McKendrick interviewed, she found widespread mistrust of the government's approach to the management of toxic substances and a high demand for reliable information upon which to make choices. Women told her that they engaged in precautionary consumption in an attempt to compensate for the fact that the government is incapable of protecting their family's health from the harms posed by toxic substances. Some go as far as entering what Andrew Saz has termed reverse quarantine mode, which is an extreme way of trying to shield the family from these harms through a very strict monitoring of the substances that enter our homes and our bodies. Okay, so I'm going to take two examples of common household chemicals and try and talk you through the process a little bit. And so we're going to talk about brominated flame retardants and phthalates. These are two classes of chemicals for which it's very difficult for anyone living in the industrialized world to make it through the day without coming in contact with. Brominated flame retardants, or BFRs, are intentionally added to consumer goods to reduce the risk of fire. They're found in fabrics, furniture, foam, carpets, and electronics. They're in our homes, our workplaces, our schools, our hospitals, etc. They're in this room, they're in the foam and the chairs you're sitting in. Phthalates are also intentionally added to products, but for the purpose of making plastics soft and malleable. They're found in food packaging and water bottles, also in car interiors, plumbing, cosmetics, and most personal care products. So a key question we have to figure out is whether exposures to these toxics can be mediated through individual choices and behavior. BFRs and phthalates share several characteristics in common that I think are hallmarks of the current toxics challenge. One, they're a subject of emerging concern and increasingly attention is paid to them in the media. Two, the exposures, as I said, they're ubiquitous. Three, the developing science regarding their toxicity points to serious potential health effects at very low doses. And they both have attracted campaigns by environmental groups. And these are the characteristics, I think, that make it likely that they would both be targeted as the type of substance by those engaging in precautionary consumption. But there are also notable differences, and I think these are important in terms of thinking through our ability to actually avoid the exposures. So there are differences in the way the substances come into contact with our bodies, what we call the routes of exposure. There's difference with respect to the length of time each chemical lingers within our bodies, what we call the persistence, and also differences with respect to the degree of bioaccumulation in the body over time, whether or not the chemical concentration increases as the chemical remains in the body. So BFRs, if we can start there, biomonitoring results show that what we call the body burden of BFRs is rising sharply since the early 1990s. They have been detected in the blood of nearly all individuals in the general population. They can be found in fetal tissues from as early as the 8th week. This is what led Environmental Defense to use the provocative term pre-polluted to describe Canadian babies in one of their recent reports. Many of these substances are persistent in the body and are bioaccumulated in tissues, including in human breast milk. House dust is the most prominent source of exposure to BFRs. That's caused by the degradation of the BFRs from the common household products. The next highest source of exposure is dietary sources. And this is because the persistence of BFRs leads to their being transferred to and bioaccumulated within the food systems. And again, all of this is worrying because the substances have an endocrine disrupting or a hormone mimicking effect. So we can say exposures to BFRs present health risks for the individual exposed, his or her children, and possibly for future generations. And when we look at the regulatory response in Canada, we find it's been generally weak. So the PBDs, these are the most common flame retardants, were listed as toxic in 2006. but the regulations enacted in 2008 prohibited only the import, manufacture, use, and sale of certain forms, most of which were already voluntarily withdrawn from the market in 2004. So now I'll turn to phthalates. Again, here we see that biomonitoring results point to significant body burdens in Canadians. Researchers have found a total of 7 types of phthalates in huge sample sizes tested, and every person tested positive for a particular phthalate called DBP. The studies also typically find that DBP exposure for women of childbearing age is up to 20 times greater than for the average person in the population. Unlike the flame retardants, ingestion of phthalates through food is the primary exposure source, and these are metabolized and excreted very quickly from the body. Phthalates also have been identified as endocrine disruptors. So, phthalates are entering our bodies directly in many ways. So they come through plastic packaging, they can come through intravenously because they're in the plastic of IV drips, they come dermally for children through the handling of toys, the application of cosmetics, sunscreens, insecticides, etc. They're a component in an astonishing variety of consumer products, and they're constantly released into the air and water during the manufacturing, their own manufacturing, and also because of the off-gassing from consumer products. Similarly, from a regulatory approach, we find that while legislators in Europe took action by banning them in 2005, and the US followed suit in children's toys in 2009, in Canada we've taken a voluntary approach. So phthalates in products intended for oral use by children have been voluntarily withdrawn. We had new regulations in June of 2011, which took them out of child care articles and specifically for 6 of the most common phthalates. So then we return to the question about the effectiveness of practicing precautionary consumption. So think again about BFR. This is found widely in the blood of nearly everyone. We know that house dust is the highest source of exposure, with dietary sources as the second most significant route. Given all of this, plus a compelling public policy rationale, so thinking about the prevention of deaths by fire, we were tempted in our study to think that while precautionary consumption practices might not work very well for BFR exposures, that smart shopping potentially could be productive at reducing body burdens of phthalates. Thinking that for phthalates, food is the primary source of exposure, and that they're quickly metabolized and excreted from the body. We also thought that since phthalates, the primary purpose is to make plastics malleable, that they might be restricted to a smaller group of substances and might be an easier place for alternatives to emerge. We were wrong about that. So phthalates, they are in this overwhelming number of applications, but the bigger challenge was that the source of exposure in the general population was as a result of broad ecosystem contamination rather than the food packaging. So that even conventionally produced as well as organically produced foods were similarly contaminated by phthalates because this occurred during the processing, handling, transportation, packaging, and storage of food, for example. So we find that phthalates are we're being widely exposed to them. They're often unlabeled, and even when they are labeled, there's a number of different product names that will be used so that it's confusing. So a 2002 study, for example, found phthalates in 52 of 72 personal care products tested, even though none of those listed the chemical on their ingredient list. This guy didn't come out very well. So, taking all of this and then recognizing that every time we see media coverage of the risks associated with toxic substances, it almost always includes advice about how to limit one's exposure, right? So the newspaper article about the new study about the risks of phthalates or BFRs. always has the last paragraph saying, and you can protect yourself and your family by. And for BFRs, the advice is this: dust and vacuum frequently, wash your hands a lot, try to purchase products that do not contain brominated flame retardants. The official Government of Canada advice on BFRs includes the helpful suggestion that you clean your house often, especially if you have young children who have the most contact with dust on the floor. For phthalates, it's a similar story. They say we should choose personal care products that do not contain phthalates, even though they won't be on the label, so we'll have to call the company to find out. Find out if the container for the product contains phthalates. You'll also have to call the company again to find the answer to that. You should avoid plastic baby bottles or water bottles, or you should buy phthalate-free bottles. And again, since phthalates become airborne and wind up in the dust in your home, frequent wet mopping is advised. So, as I think most of you will see, the advice for minimizing our exposures to BFRs and phthalates revolves around food preparation, household cleaning, and smart shopping. All of these are forms of domestic labor that are disproportionately performed by women, despite the ironic graphic that I found on the web. All right, so I think the social science evidence about the responsibility that women continue to bear in terms of social reproduction, sustainability of the household, health of family members is uncontested. And this is what results in the inequitable sharing of the burden related to the task of what David Boyd calls dodging the toxic bullet. So in other words, precautionary consumption is women's work. But to be clear, we should think of this from a regulatory perspective. So this is a regulatory shift that results in the placing of responsibility for reducing toxic exposures on individual consumers, and this approach adds to the burden of unpaid domestic labor that disproportionately falls to women. So this shift reinforces women's socially prescribed roles as providers for the household. It adds to our care burden from both a physical and an emotional perspective, and it contributes to the gender division of labor within households, the exploitation of women's unpaid work in the home. So as we would expect as well, of course, women vary dramatically in the extent of their capacities to engage in these behaviors. So we vary according to the very familiar social axes that include income, socioeconomic, race, and level of education. This is clearly a problem that we will not shop our way out of. The second reason I'm skeptical about precautionary consumption is that, as I mentioned, it just might be futile. It might not actually be effective at reducing the toxic body burdens of those who are pouring their time and energy into it. A key assumption central to the promotion of labeling as the policy solution to this problem is that motivated individuals with the right information will actually be able to reduce their exposures. I'm not meaning here to detract in any way from the good work that has been done by people who are trying to give guidance, right? And all of this work, and especially David Boyd's as well as Smith and Lowry's, acknowledges very openly that the limits of green consumerism have been known for a long time. But again, if I can take the example of the BFRs and the phthalates to illustrate my point, I'm going to try and unpack that a little further for you. So, there have been various studies trying to judge the effectiveness of precautionary consumption practices. One of those studies showed that even with training from researchers, student interns took an average of 5 minutes per product to wade through the ingredient lists and the environmental and health claims. They learned, again, that contacting the manufacturers was time-consuming and of little use. They also documented obstacles like resource constraints, since the non-toxic alternative is always more expensive than the mainstream brand. The proximity to green retailers was important, and also having the time available to make multiple trips for shopping for different products in different shops. So the work of precautionary consumption is hard, but also the results from clinical studies are mixed as to whether the body burdens actually drop when people enter even the extreme reverse quarantine mode. So this is what's led academics like Rebecca Altman to say that the belief that exposure to chemicals can be avoided through altered consumer behavior is a consumption fallacy. The error in the belief, she says, lies in assuming that consumer choice is unbounded, when in fact our choices are highly constrained. So, the highly educated and motivated of us might be able to buy the right sofas and carpets and electronics for our home, but none of us will choose those for our schools, our offices, our hospitals, and our libraries. So our control over these exposures will continue to be limited even if effective labeling was in place. Further, even if we could protect ourselves through precautionary consumption strategies, the workers inside the manufacturing facilities and the communities surrounding them would continue to be exposed to these emissions until the substances are eliminated from our economies. And finally, social scientists have observed that a few symbolic actions in this regard actually prevents individuals from considering more profound changes to their lifestyles and their consumption. In other words, we come to believe that we're doing enough by altering a few of our buying habits. Unfortunately, these symbolic measures may include switching to other products that are perceived to be greener but actually contain the same undesired chemicals, or switching one or two high-profile products and continuing to use many others that result in the same types of exposures. Okay. So the third reason, and this is, I think, the most important one, is that there's a distinct possibility that engaging in precautionary consumption actually exacerbates inequities, so that ethical, responsible, precautionary consumers in the city are actually projecting pollution and ill health on those living on the periphery, those downstream of the industrial complexes and the extractive sites that fuel this type of consumption. And one reason for this, I think, is that practicing precautionary consumption detracts from collective action directed towards longer-term solutions and the construction of alternative economies. So Sherilyn McGregor, for example, has shown empirically that individualized attempts to mediate exposures leave women with less time and energy available to engage in environmental and political activism aimed at systemic regulatory change. Reverse quarantine, this idea of constructing boundaries around our social world, shoring up our homes and bodies against the chemicals thought to be lingering in the outside environment, actually involves isolating oneself and one's family rather than building community and attempting collective change. Worse, those who can afford expensive products feel safer, which actually weakens the mass of people available to work for a broader reform. The result is a negative feedback loop of lax regulation and increasingly anxious shoppers without mobilizing any effective political opposition. So Andrew Sass argues that attempts to deal with an environmental health threat individually through changes to consumption actually means the process of politicization never even begins. And politicization is necessary because we all know that environmental problems themselves are problems of consumption. So, we understand this to be true, and yet we find these types of campaigns and these types of measures everywhere we look. On the one hand, there's an idea that these are the kinds of measures are the best we can get in the current political climate, certainly federally. I've heard this rationale offered plenty of times, and of course on one level you can agree. But I also worry that it gives up too easily on the obligation we all have for actually constituting that political climate. So we, the individual consumers, and those designing these kinds of campaigns are the ones allowing the opposition parties to be passive, to fail to actually mount an effective challenge. So I think it's risky to say that we're going to embrace this shallow version of ecological citizenship just for now, just until things get a little bit better. In fact, I think it's becoming more urgent to do so. When we combine the prevalence of these weak, incentive-based forms of regulation with the effect of the actual rollbacks of environmental law that we have seen recently, so I'm talking about existing rights and duties that were concretely present in legislation until the budget bills of 2012, those concrete protections are now gone. Combining this with the prevalence of these weak incentive-based forms, I think paints a pretty bleak picture. It's decidedly not the case that we're just layering these voluntary forms of regulation that empower citizens and unleash corporate creativity on top of an existing body of law that already shelters ecosystems. It's that we're rapidly stripping back the body of law that did provide those protections at the same time as we're coming forward with these very weak incentive-based forms of regulation that are intended to make us all feel as if we still are acting as good ecological citizens. So just to conclude, I want to try to make a bridge between the practices of ecological citizenship that demand only precautionary consumption and the kinds of aims of environmental justice activists more broadly. I think it's pretty easy for us to see that the precautionary consumer who brings home the green dish soap that's still produced by Clorox is not going to shut down or even fundamentally disrupt Chemical Valley or the production of pollution that's necessarily part of it. This is especially true if those symbolic actions detract from the efforts to reduce the consumption of goods overall, and especially the consumption of fossil energy. Looked at from this angle, the precautionary consumer is not just enabling the production of chemicals and the associated pollution to continue in Sarnia, but is also enabling the continued transport of dilbit in pipelines from Alberta into Sarnia's refineries. So turning our attention to the diverse terrains and domains onto which cities project their effects and from which they meet their needs, this helps us to understand what's at stake in the bigger picture. The ecological hinterland for our petroleum products and our plastics, even our BPA-free plastics, includes the people in the formerly wild spaces downstream of the tar sands in Alberta. It has for a century included the people of Aamjiwnaang First Nation downstream of Sarnia's Chemical Valley. And it may soon include a whole host of other Canadian communities that will be crossed by an ever-growing set of new pipelines. If tidewater is reached, that hinterland will also include communities in China or India or wherever our bitumen is headed. So the urban ecological citizen is projecting her effects outwards onto the periphery, and she's also projecting effects downstream along a social gradient, with the most marginalized facing the biggest health burdens. The literature on ecological citizenship has been useful for enlarging the scope of obligations that we see as part of our civic duties. But my worry is that the current articulations are only empowering those positioned to know or to enact a particular conception of what the good green life would entail. And to do so minimizes the zone of contestability around ecological issues. A more robust form of ecological citizenship would include greater recognition of how we're all attached in different ways to the natural world. Try as we might, it's impossible to disembed ourselves from social and ecological contexts. A more robust notion of ecological citizenship would position each of us less as individuals with agency, preferences, and choices, and more as embodied beings immersed in ecosystems and attentive to our differences in position. Those differences in position are shaping our subjectivity and they're conditioning our agency. We would reject individual forms of action for more collective ones. And this would be part of a larger project of recasting our obligations with respect to toxics in an environmental justice framework. Part of what needs to be done, I think, is to avoid the tendency to let the individual chemical enemies, we want to avoid letting individual chemical the chemical enemy become the focus of our concern. So it's not BPA, it's not BFRs, there's too many acronyms. There's not phthalates. It's not the chemical that is the enemy, right? It is that we need to broaden our gaze to consider the system that produces that chemical and the social and the political and gender relations that enable it to continue being produced and consumed. Those are the systems, those broader systems that enable the continued production of those chemicals that we need to engage in as ecological citizens. So thank you, and I'll take some questions. Oh, I have another slide. There it is. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was intrigued by your example of a compound that was banned in Europe and then subsequently not banned in Canada, but it's kind of based on its precautionary labeling and precaution on my onus to kind of figure it out. And it all was based on some form of wide knowledge that this in fact is a toxic substance and that I should pay attention to it.
Yeah.
Can you tell me when that shift kind of occurred? Is it consistent with the recent government at the federal level, or has it been occurring in Canada as opposed to, say, Europe earlier? That model, you're sort of basing the whole talk on, if I get it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it's cool. I don't think it's only a product of the current government, although it certainly has been exacerbated a little bit. So, although I don't even know if that is true actually. So the toxics management section under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act has been in place since 1995. And it's the basic system that sets up how we do the risk assessments for these various substances. So it sets the legislative framework that allows them to take the kinds of measures they're taking now. And what we decided at that time was that we would do risk assessments for a whole host of new and existing substances, decide which were toxic, and the ones that we determined to be toxic according to the risk assessment framework would be added to something called Schedule 1, which is the list of toxic substances. What we didn't do in that piece of legislation is say that some specific consequences must flow from adding a substance to the list. So that means we in Canada can go through the assessment of whether substances are toxic, find them to be toxic according to those risk assessment procedures, add them to the list of toxic substances, and then do nothing about it. So the choice of whether or not to bring forward what they call risk management measures is left up to the executive at the time. So we have several examples in Canada. So the BPA is the highest profile one. This is when they decided that that chemical in baby bottles was harmful. And that was determined to be toxic under the Act, according to the definition. But the only risk management measure that was brought forward in response to that was one that banned its use in baby bottles. That means you and I and everyone here is exposed to it continually, even though it's on the list of toxic substances. So that basic regulatory structure has been in place since 1995. And of course, the decision as to whether or not you'll bring forward risk management measures in response to a substance being listed depends on the executive of the government in power at the time. The Liberals were no good at this either. And they notoriously just were really slow at the risk assessments, didn't take much action on anything. The Conservatives, when they got the majority, did change a number of things and sped up the risk assessment process. That's why we started to see a number of things become listed as toxic quite quickly. But again, I think the main criticism is that they never followed those up with risk assessment measures that mattered. They only have followed those with voluntary measures, pollution prevention plans, and all these various kind of fluffy things that don't have any teeth. Yeah.
So, given the most recent approval by Harper of the FIPA on Friday, what's the impact of that free trade agreement with China on the introduction of more toxic substances into our goods and foods and?
I'm not sure. I think we were having a conversation over dinner about the impact of some of the remedies that are available to investors within that treaty. I haven't really thought through how it's going to affect toxics management. There have been a couple of cases, mainly around pesticides, where foreign companies have sued Canadian governments. So Quebec was sued, for example, under Chapter 11 of NAFTA in relation to their attempt to ban 2,4-D, the pesticide. And those kinds of remedies are now going to be available to Chinese investors under this, well, to different extent under this treaty. So it's possible that we might see some of that, but that would presume that our government would actually try and take the step of banning a chemical that somebody produced, a foreign company produced, and we haven't seen a ban in over a decade, so I don't know why they would all of a sudden start now. Yeah.
So it's more of a comment than a question, but what you're describing and what it boils down to is a total lack of political will. There's actually a very simple remedy that's been available to us for a long time, and I was involved in the early 1980s in Toronto in a project called Our Chemical Society looking at this. We could adopt the European standards. We could adopt the best standards in the world. There's nothing to stop the Canadian government saying we will match the best protective measures that exist in a comparable society like Europe. What is missing is a combination of the political will to do that and the public outrage that would push that, because it is actually outrageous, because we are actually involved in a massive global experiment based on no informed consent to find out what happens when you expose the entire population to a body burden of toxic pollutants throughout their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically an experiment being performed on us without our consent. And yet what is lacking is the public outrage that would push the government to do what is actually really very simple, which is to say, we'll match the European standards. That'll be a good place, at least to start.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I worked in the public health in Toronto, we used to call what is called the health protection branch in Health Canada the industrial protection branch, because that's really what they did, was protect industry, and they're still doing it.
Yeah.
30 years later. It's actually completely outrageous what is happening.
Yeah, and I think, interesting to draw the point about consent to the contrast with the way the language about choice informs these new types of measures, right? We're actually choose according with our preferences how much toxic substances each of us wants to be exposed to.
Yeah.
Apparently.
BS. To use an academic term.
Shall I do the questions? Or
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a common sense everyday principle that says that if harm's coming my way, I can respond to it.
Yeah.
And thinking less of the legal issues or the legal nuances, I'm just wondering whether there are public response strategies or shaming strategies that will more directly alter corporate behavior than waiting for the slow wheels of regulation to come around and make a difference.
I'm not sure. I don't know. One of the things I thought you may have been going at when you were saying, people have a natural reaction to try and prevent harm to themselves is, the idea that we almost can't avoid taking these kinds of strategies now, the precautionary consumption strategies, that people feel like they don't have a choice, they have to engage in this. And I understand that, and where we came at this project from was not one of okay, let's figure out a way to tell people how to behave, right, or make people feel weird about the kinds of behaviors that they engage in. But it was more one of trying to figure out what kind of campaigns as an advocacy group should we mount, and what kind of campaigns should we endorse. And that's where we became very uncomfortable because as you can imagine, a research group working on toxics and gender, we got all kinds of requests to endorse various types of campaigns like this that were organized around basically a labeling type of demand. And, you know, I never felt comfortable with the orientation of trying to convince people that precautionary consumption is not something they should be engaged in, because people do feel they're protecting their health and their families. But I do want to think about at what cost, right? So if we only have a limited amount of time and energy to put into this, I certainly think there are more important things that we can each be doing rather than, you know, spending a lot of time researching which is the best sofa, which sofa is going to emit the fewest things into my home, whatever. But I don't know what the larger political strategy to all of a sudden shift and make things move faster is. I don't, there probably isn't one. But maybe I'm not using enough hope. Trevor told me to make sure I had hope. Were you watching?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, Sarah.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on that thread about hope, and thanks so much, Dayna. I know we've shared lots of thoughts over the years of ecological citizenship, and I'm just very curious about your impressions around the Charter of Rights and Freedoms Challenge and where you think that fits within the ecological citizenship framework, because of course this is an action by two individuals. So are you hopeful that it will complicate your understanding of ecological citizenship, or this kind of precautionary form of citizenship, or where does it fit within kind of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I'm never one to really say that litigation is a collective strategy of resistance. But I guess it does depend on the situation, and in this case, it certainly, you know, so we're talking about, in Namjanang, there's been did I talk about this? Yeah, I've talked about it so many times today, I can't remember if I said it
But
here or not.
it would be great if you could just set up the arguments in the beautiful way you did at lunch. Just
Okay.
very understandable for anyone who doesn't understand the term.
Okay, so in Namjanang, 2 residents decided to try to challenge the way the minister had granted a permit to Suncor that would allow them to increase their emissions, because they already felt they faced a very heavy load of emissions and were experiencing health effects in relation to it. And the way the challenge was organized, it's a judicial review, so it's basically saying the minister didn't have the power to issue the permit to Suncor because the minister didn't conduct what they call a cumulative effects assessment. So they didn't sort of stand back and say, given the burden of pollution that's already present in this community, should we add to that or not? They just look specifically at that one individual permit and decide that the health burden associated with it is acceptable. And so the argument is that the minister was wrong to make that decision. In fact, it was unconstitutional to make that decision, and it's based on 2 sections in the Charter of Rights and Freedom. Section 7 is the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and here they're making arguments about the health effects related to the pollution, including the psychological effects of living with these kind of it's kind of like a waiting for the manifestation of health effects, right? When it's something like cancers or miscarriages, this kind of thing has a toll on people because they feel like they're always waiting for the devastating illness to emerge. So that's section 7, and section 15 is the equality rights claim. This is the very innovative and new part of it, and as I was saying today, the way our friend Ron Plain, who's one of the litigants, explains the equality rights aspect of it, is he says that Indigenous people there face a dilemma that non-Native folks do not face. And he's saying specifically the dilemma is, do I accept these devastating health impacts to myself and my family and continue to live here, or do I leave the reserve at a great social, cultural, and economic cost to myself? This is a dilemma that non-Native people do not face, and therefore this is an equality rights issue. It was a bit easier to explain today because I have the map, and it's a spatial problem, the way the air pollution is flowing in Sarnia, the way it affects people on the reserve. But That's essentially the claim. So it would be the first time in Canada that courts would acknowledge that routine permitted pollution could be unconstitutional. And that would be implicitly, I guess, an acknowledgement that we have the right to a healthy environment, a healthier environment in Canada. Did I answer that question? Yeah? No. What was it, Sarah, again?
I was curious how the challenge itself might fit within
Oh,
the
yes.
framing of ecological citizenship.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I actually think some of the other activism that's emerged around the charter challenge in Aamjiwnaang in recent years, so people that are drawing connections between the experience of people in Aamjiwnaang. So we had this youth exchange that was organized between some of the youth in Aamjiwnaang and some of the youth in Fort Chip, where they were talking about the way that communities like Aamjiwnaang that are downstream of refineries are actually downstream of the tar sands as well, and they were talking about common experiences. They've done some, they participated in I Don't Know More demonstrations, they've done some direct action stuff related to pipelines. I actually think those are the expressions of citizenship that are more critical or as critical as the litigation, but I mean, we don't know what will, perhaps it will kind of stimulate something else. It's possible. There was somebody here. Yeah.
I was wondering if anyone in this area has looked at if precautionary consumerism, so these actions, can be like gateways into more proactive environmental activism, political involvement, that sort of thing. If people can get angry when they find this so difficult and then realize it's lack of regulation.
There actually have been a couple of studies. So what's the group in the US? I think it's the Silent Spring Institute in Massachusetts. There's been some studies around some breast cancer clusters that are related to industrial activity on Long Island, I think. And there's a group of researchers that does argue that biomonitors, what they did with these women is ask them to participate in a biomonitoring study. So they had tissues taken, blood or urine or fingernails or whatever, and they had their levels of toxins measured and delivered back to them. And then they all tried to reduce their toxic body burdens after having received this baseline amount. And these researchers argue that it is actual a form of collective political engagement, that they then became, as you said, angry and motivated. But from my perspective, that study is more compelling in that it's one of the ones that I cited in support of the proposition that it actually was really hard to get your body burden down. So these are women who were very ill and were very motivated and had all the right information and advice and became more and more frustrated over time that each time they had their urine tested, they still couldn't get their body burdens down. So that's, I think for me, it's been one of the more powerful sources of trying to critique the model rather than the opposite.
Did they go on then to lobby for changes, or do you know?
Some of them, of course, died, but I'm not sure of the others. Yeah.
I had a question that sort of maybe zoomed out a little bit that kind of draws on two interesting points that I think I heard you say. Try to articulate well. One is, and I really appreciate the point that this sort of focus distracts us from putting the kind of meaningful political pressure on the opposition parties to force the parties in power to enact the kind of regulations that we would like to see.
Yeah.
But it leads me to think that even if we had the best toxic substances regulation in the world, and I could walk around the corner Shoppers Drug Mart and buy shampoo that's not full of some toxic chemical, a couple of things. One, what will they come up with next?
Yeah.
And two, the processes that nonetheless go into creating all the goods we want to buy in a capitalist consumer society create a level of toxicity generally that we have to question whether or not that's acceptable. So that brings me to another point you mentioned, which is this distracts us from a question as well as, should we be consuming less goods?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess so what I'm trying to get in a sort of misguided way or rambling way is this, the critique you've levied, is that also a broader critique that we can make and ask the question, can we fix this problem within capitalist consumerism? Can we achieve a tolerable level or a healthy environment that we want within it, or do we need to be working towards some kind of a more fundamental change?
Yeah, I mean, I do think you're probably right that it's a function of capitalism, this problem, and that we obviously need to work towards something more fundamental. It's partly also what I was trying to get at with the chemical enemy thing, the thing that I couldn't say, because as you were saying, like, what are they going to come with next? This is the alternatives assessment problem. We're trying to, when I say we, I mean across the industrialized world, people are thinking about the design of chemicals management regimes, are trying to figure out how to do alternatives assessment so that we don't end up in this problem that you've identified, and this has happened with the flame retardants most obviously, where we just keep finding ones to be toxic and they just keep making one that's very similar and has the same effects on the body, and we just kind of like, it's whack-a-mole, right? And we're just constantly changing, like in this game. And there's some movement in that direction. So they've been trying to now do exposure assessments based on mode of action in the body. So actually grouping whole classes of chemicals together and saying, well, they act the same in the body, so we should actually do an exposure assessment aggregate for all of them and then figure out if there's a toxic effect. But again, in a way, we're on this treadmill of a chemical by chemical approach, and the resources that we devote to it in terms of risk assessment is crazy. So there are better ways. I mean, in some ways, toxic use reduction is better. This is the approach that kind of says, we're done with risk assessment. We're not going to bother with all that, figuring out which of these substances are safe anymore. We're going to just work towards getting them out of our economies. So in Massachusetts, again, they have a good toxic use reduction law, which basically just says, and interestingly, it's based kind of on a rationale like these other reporting and disclosure bylaws. So it says, you tell us how much of each of these substances you use every year, and then you reduce it by 10% a year. And that's like, just get it going down now, all of them. We don't care which one is most toxic, least toxic, whatever, just start reducing your use of them. And we tried a little bit in Ontario to get a law like this, so we have something now called the Toxic Use Reduction Act in Ontario. Ours is kind of a watered down and not very effective version of that. But that would be the more radical approach, would be to just stop doing risk assessment completely, recognize that we get caught up forever in it, and to try to just work kind of proactively to other ways of achieving our social objectives that don't include the production of so many chemicals.
So the question
your focus has been on chemical pollution. I was wondering if you could comment at all on other forms of environmental pollution, in particular electromagnetic radiation, which is an even more insidious form that nobody seems to be aware of yet.
Yeah, I don't know much about it. I know that many of the dynamics are common in the sense of the kinds of problems with toxicology evidence versus epidemiology, and how are we ever going to figure out what level is safe enough or risky or what. But I actually don't know what the regulatory regime around that is. It is an interesting one to consider. And all of these, I mean, I can see lots of places where the same dynamic is happening in terms of these really uncertain health risks. So there is electromagnetic field stuff. There's questions with respect to wind turbines and whether or not people are actually experiencing health effects related to living close to them. And in each of these cases, it's tricky, because, well, especially the wind turbine case I find really tricky because proponents of renewable energy often are coming forward with the same kinds of arguments that we're used to the chemical industry coming forward with, right? Like, well, you can't actually prove that you have any health effects. You know, this is probably caused by something else. And so while I think there are legitimate public policy reasons for saying, yeah, we need to focus on renewables because, by the way, these other more conventional forms of energy are really making people sick, I think that the kinds of arguments that have been mobilized have too much in common with those that have been used by industry for so long that they, you know, they make us feel sick listening to them. But I don't know much about that, I'm sorry.
I want to draw you back to the beginning of the argument that you presented, which turns on the right to know.
Yeah.
And there are actually two parts to my question. One is just to ask you to comment on the tension in your own argument.
Yeah.
Because although the right to know may underpin the drive to precautionary consumerism, it's also a precondition for the kind of collective action that you suggest as an alternative. People have to know about a problem if they're going to act collectively on that problem. So I'm just asking you to reflect on that a bit. But I'm also curious about, you say you've dealt with a lot of organizations, environmental organizations that have demanded information, but then have used it in such a way as to encourage precautionary consumerism. Do you have any sense of why they're going down that path? Is that just because they despair of the regulatory authorities, or is there something more fundamental that leads them to turn away from the other kinds of political campaigns that they could wage that would point towards the kind of collective action that you favor?
Okay, thanks. First point about the citizens' right to know. I think my answer to that would differ depending on the specific regime we're thinking about. So, you know, the fracking example that I gave, I think is one clearly where we have to ask for the disclosure of this information so as to be able to mount an effective opposition to fracking. But even saying that, I'm not totally convinced because, you know, there's lots of reasons for us to oppose fracking completely outside of which specific chemicals are they injecting into the ground and what quantities, right? And so the demand to include that in the NPRI so that we can have this annual release of data as, you know, the extent of our strategy certainly is not it. I'm sympathetic to the idea that as advocacy groups, we're always looking for an opening, right? So on fracking, if you're trying to draw attention to this issue over and over, why not take the federal government's refusal to add fracking fluids to the NPRI as a place to jump up and down and make noise about fracking? Like, certainly I think that's understandable. I guess my point is more to just not let these things become, it's not the citizens' right to know just for the sake of having the disclosure of that data or information, right? We can't stop the fight with those. We have to be able to move on to the next thing we want to do with that data. And in some cases, like when it's calls for labeling, so the Breast Cancer Action Montreal are a fabulous group of women that we've had lots of engagement with, and in particular, over the question of whether, you know, we could support their campaign for the disclosure of carcinogens on personal care products. And that's one that I just, I'm not sure I see the real point of going down that road. I don't think it actually will mobilize people to take collective action. I think it'll just make them choose different cosmetics. And again, I think the drawbacks associated with them engaging in that kind of action are, you know, there are higher costs and benefits associated with it. Your second question, can you remind me briefly?
Well, just if you have any theory about why these organizations go
yeah.
down this path.
Yeah. I've wondered a lot about it. You know, I even took a look at a bunch of websites today and trying to refresh myself with who's doing what. Lots of times what you find is that the precautionary consumption type strategies are right there amongst a lot of really good, even radical collective action type ways that they approach their organizing on different issues. It seems that with toxics, we're in this disclosure void or something, right? Like almost every group that you find has some campaign that's aimed directly at women choosing the right cosmetics, and it's infuriating. I don't know, it seems that they think that's all we can accomplish in terms of our organizing is to try to figure out what the right cosmetics to buy are. But the ones that I actually have engaged with will tell me that they think, politically it's a terrible time to open up the CEPA, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which regulates toxic substances. They'll say, oh my gosh, if we open up the CEPA now, we'll get one 10 times worse than what we got in 1995. That's probably true, but as I said, it's not a reason to just sit back and take a different strategy and wait for things to get better. Was there somebody else? No?
Well, I'm just wondering if there's another factor at play, because what we're also seeing right now is a federal government that is going after and auditing NGOs and charities that it doesn't like.
Engage in advocacy.
And education is okay and not really challengeable, but organizing is political action, and that makes you susceptible to audit. So I'm wondering if there's some element of that in this as well, sort of protecting.
It's possible that, but I don't know that these organizations would be able to call even these kinds of campaigns research and not advocacy. Maybe it's possible.
But they can call them education.
Yeah, possibly. Certainly that's a dynamic that's having an effect on all of these organizations, yeah. The other thing I should have mentioned is that there are a couple of groups who do it, who are doing it in a better way, so that we're getting, what's the American one called? I'm forgetting now. Maybe it's the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics, but anyway, there's a group that actually, it's more like send a note to your MP telling them that you want these products out of, or these substances out of shampoo or whatever it is, right? And it's more of like a politically engaged information strategy rather than a kind of passive consumerist one. So there is some movement to move out of that mold as well.
Well, how did BPA get taken out of the label bottles? What was the story behind that? If that worked with, well, you can tell me how it worked, I guess, and how it could be applied elsewhere.
Well, so I think what happened is in 2006 is when the federal government said they were going to be tough on toxics, which really was, from my perspective, a bit of fishing around for, oh my gosh, we need an environmental issue that we're good on because we can't be good on climate change and we don't want to shut down the tar sands, and so we'll be tough on toxics. And then they did a couple of symbolic things, I think. Environmental defense put a ton of resources at that time into BPA, baby bottles, and motivating moms. And that was pretty influential, I think. But basically, the risk assessment for BPA came at a time, so in 2006, the government announced that their new chemicals management plan, and they put 200 of the highest priority chemicals on a list, and they said, we're going to list these as toxic unless industry can bring forward the information to prove otherwise. They called it the challenge. So at the time, we were all fairly optimistic about this because, since 1995 and before, the regulatory assumption, the onus of proof, if you will, was always that chemicals were non-toxic until proven toxic, right? So they kind of were coming out with this list of 200 and saying like, listen, we think these are bad, and unless industry comes with some data, we're going to put them on the list. And in that first batch, they called the batches of chemicals that they did the assessments for, they did list a number to be toxic, and BPA came up in the second batch. And the interesting thing about it is at the time, the file on BPA was quite thin. In other words, really wasn't much evidence at all. So there were a number, from what I understand, there were a number of people on the advisory panel that reviewed these decisions that were really uncomfortable with the idea that we could list a chemical as toxic when we had so little amount of toxicological data about its effects. But the government had come forward with this reverse onus, and so they were kind of stuck in a position to go ahead with it. And in the end, I think what they accomplished was a big win in terms of environmental defense owed them. They made a big splash about it. They got a lot of media for having been the first jurisdiction to list it as toxic, and then 6 months later when they had to release their risk management measures, it was a watered down measure that really only took it out of baby bottles. So, and then attention moved away from that issue, and they got a political win out of it that it's important. It was important, I think, that we took that step, but I don't know how broadly an impact it has, right? So still in the lining of tin cans, still affecting low-income people more than it's affecting high-income people. It's still for a long time was in the cash debit receipts, and probably still is, so it's affecting women who work disproportionately as cashiers and as grocers and stuff like that. So I think there's still some issues around our exposures to it.
It seems to me that the presentation you've made to us this evening is a catalog of disappointments. And I just wonder what your, can you present kind of an idealized situation?
You've come to the halcyon West Coast. We need to lead us to something uplifting. From the toxic mess of this area.
Well, I ask specifically because the thing that all of us understand is that there is enormous hidden or largely hidden violence in a lot of this corporate behavior and chemical behavior and chemical production behavior, but it's rarely seen as violence. And I don't want to beat this theme to death, but it does occur to me that if you point a gun at somebody and invite them to change their behavior, they really will. So I'm just wondering, at least in a metaphoric sense, what the gun might be.
Yeah, just really direct action. So what gives me hope? People are still, willing to come together and try and defend their interests in particular places and their communities and their way of life. And, also what else gives me hope is that, we can engage with really thoughtful people in these organizations about what their strategies are going forward. And we've found lots of them to be open to the critique and to thinking about what better ways of doing this kind of advocacy are. And so I thought those things are optimistic. Did I do it?
Are you reassured, Jean?
Dayna, I have to admit that we don't, if we think of our media and the sort of what we engage in, thinking about cities and largely political action and the environmental movement in BC, we don't think about toxics all that much. We spend a lot of money thinking about big trees and about smart growth and the way in which we create livable communities for certain aspects of our population. So thank you so much for bringing a very different perspective, not only to Victoria, but also to our sort of collective thinking on these issues.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.